Hello, thank you very much for having me here. The title of the talk is Climate Justice and Survival, Lessons Learned from the COVID-19 Crisis. So there is a rich tradition of literature on how people understand and talk about climate change. For example, academics have explored how media, and predominantly Western press, talk about climate change, as well as how does the public articulate and discuss the issues connected to climate change. Our own work highlighted how the crises of science, morals, and expertise were already bubbling under the hood. For example, the scientific basis of climate change was undermined in the press by the use of religious metaphors suggesting that climate change was a matter of belief rather than facts backed by evidence. The moral duty of protecting others, as well as the environment, was undermined by people using moral disengagement strategies to avoid action. And the very idea of who an expert on climate change was being undermined, and people from all walks of life used different strategies to claim expertise in the area. With the arrival of COVID-19, this all exploded. This is when we started looking for an organic explanation, an account of what was happening. Hegemonic social representations came to the rescue. In Talia Maglioglu's theoretical framework, hegemonic social representations are matrices, that is, containers of all available information which can be combined and recombined to create different social representations. Most importantly, hegemonic social representations are embedded in the fiber of our society, in our thinking, our learning and working practices, in our institutions. They are so omnipresent that sometimes we don't even realize they're there. To illustrate this, Moscovici referred to Sinbad the Sailor's story. Travelers land on an island and marvel at the pure spring water and the abundance of fruit in the orchards. Some drink their fill, others bathe. Others again light a fire and prepare their meal. They do not realize that this island is a huge fish that has been asleep for so long in the ocean that trees have grown out on its back. Feeling the sting of the fire lit by the travelers, it suddenly rises and dives down, pulling down everyone with it towards the abyss. Here we have a powerful image suggesting representations that have been objectified for so long that we no longer notice them. But that does not prevent their being almost ubiquitously in the substratum of everything that we conceive as materially independent and given in social life. Under the impetus of some event or change, these representations resurface. And as everything today is in flux, they make themselves felt even before crystallizing in a specific action or reality. Our argument is that the COVID crisis awoke a hegemonic social representation which was resting asleep, much like what Moscovici describes in this passage. This reminded me a lot of Terry Pratchett's word In the Back of a Turtle, which is the best way in which I understand hegemonic social representations. So what hegemonic social representation was awoken by the arrival of COVID? We argued that the hegemonic social representation that was awoken was the one of survival, and that this particular matrix or hegemonic social representation is relevant also for understanding and acting on climate justice. As we mentioned earlier, during COVID crisis, many of the strategies which were observed in the literature as strategies directed at casting doubt or undermining climate change science were adopted. But we could see a flurry of different discourses or strategies which we could reconduct to the key issue of survival. Who is responsible for society well-being? What is the role of science, politicians, the people, nature? Are they threats or saviors? In other words, COVID awoke the fish, and the very idea of survival and the system's assumption as to whether the responsibility lies to when it comes to guaranteeing survival have been laid bare. This battle of signification is crucial in establishing the subject of our survival. Who is the we, our sense of we-ness, that Yetten and colleagues have identified as the best way forward in the case of COVID. Who is the we? Who are the people or things or beings that we need to save, and whose survival we as a society have the duty to guarantee? An important feature of hegemonic social representation is its being embedded in the fibers of society, in its institutions. And we can see how the COVID crisis unveiled the biases embedded in our societies, which scholars had already identified and denounced when it came to climate change. Our institutions are not designed for the survival of all, only for the survival of some. So the question is, what can we do about it? This quote from Fears, I find, is quite interesting because it highlights how hegemonic relations are always a mixture of force and consent, and describe a situation in which the ruling class has no viable competition in imposing its view on reality. So how can we provide a viable competition? Meg John Barker argues that while many try to either stick to existing dominant rules or stick to alternative, polemic, or even self-imposed rules, a possible way to challenge hegemony is to become more aware of the fact that we are indeed holding on to rules and losing our grip on it. When it comes to social justice and climate justice, in my opinion, this would look like majority group being less rigid in imposing their solutions and way forwards, and more humble in listening to others. This is where the decolonization curriculum becomes particularly important in psychology, for example, but in climate science in general. From the viewpoint of minoritized groups, on the other hand, the work would be that of uniting the struggles and recognizing, for example, that climate justice is social justice in the broadest sense possible. In order for alternative polemic representations to have a shot at becoming hegemonic, We need a coherent vision of how a society embracing social and climate justice would look like, as well as what institutions and laws would be needed to make this happen. A perfect example of challenge to hegemony coming from a minority is the video showing Alistair Stewart, a journalist from GB News, advocating for policies proposed by Extinction Rebellion while condemning at the same time the means by which these policies were advocated through. In other words, the idea made it through, though the journalist still holds on to his condemnation of the means. So we see once again that while we can use the same ingredients and build alternative representation, using the same institutions, the same shapes, the same forms that we have available through the hegemonic view of reality, this results inevitably in a biased view, limited by the very nature of our institutions that reflect only a partial view of reality and society. The only way forward that I can see is being able, yes, to use the ingredients we have available and the institutions that we have existing within our society to create an environment that is more receptive of new idea. But we do need to listen to outside, to be able to take on messages, to take on direction from those who do not even belong to the same structures, to the same societies, to the same cultures as we do. We need to put ourselves in a listening position, one that is open to learning and growing in a world that is united by the threat of the change in climate. And this is never gonna find a solution unless we achieve social justice as well.